We need to stop doing that.
Why?
It's becoming too much.
It's becoming too much for who? We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse the... I forgot I have my laptop there. I have another screen. We are actually back, ladies and gentlemen, after being gone for almost a month, I guess. It's
More
muscle
than a
and
month.
feels. More than a
Goddamn.
month. But we're back. Direct from Athens, Greece, and from Southampton, UK. Milo, Wolf, and Pack are here for the experience that you all needed and the experience that the podcast scene needs. The unsung heroes of the fitness scene are here. Okay, I'm going to stop singing our praises now and coming up with stuff. The Mechanical Watches podcast is here. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. Can you explain why your name is currently displayed as Dr. Paul Carter?
Because I thought, look, we've done the whole science thing in quotation marks for those listening. We've done research, we've looked at studies, but it's time to be actually evidence-based about, fitness and about muscle growth and strength. So I want to draw some inspiration from Paul Carter and assume the Paul Carter
Holy shit, brother.
identity, I guess, along with any mannerisms, knowledge, and obviously approach to scientific data. So that's why I've chosen to use his name. In one, to honor him, and two, to subconsciously and consciously push myself to be better and do better. As a bald man, I'm not sure if I'm weaker, but I'm definitely fatter. I'm not sure if I'm shorter, but I'm definitely less muscular and 150% less science-based than Paul Carter. So the only thing I can do is look up to him and do my best to imitate him, because imitation is the best form of flattery.
Agreed. And you are also not Christian, which is a downside. What I'll
I
say
am a
is
real
that
Christian, Paul Carter, no offense, Orthodox and baptized, so I'll see you in
Damn.
church.
your move, Paul. Very quickly, I want to give an update on the Paul Carter feud. So we've had our highs and lows. Let's put it that way. I know the last podcast we did on Paul Carter, I kind of said that he was not being very nice to me. But then recently, actually, we shared a meme about training to failure in hypertrophy based on some recent data, where he messaged me personally out of the blue. He doesn't even follow me, to tell me, respect, brother, with a yes sir emoji. And he went on to say that we need more people like me in the industry, people who are willing to change their opinions based on the data coming out. And I was like, wow, this is a new arc. This is the new Paul Carter. He's back, improved. We're building a relationship here. It's phenomenal. But then more recently, unfortunately, he has come back to me and he specifically said, I saw the shitty podcast you did. Now, I didn't respond to his messages, which I'm typically in the habit of doing. I'm not sure if he's referring to Muscle and Feels or to another podcast, but he went on for about another one probably. But if you're in Muscle and Feels, joke's on him. We don't even release episodes anymore.
Yes, and we are a de facto shitty podcast, and that's why we're the best podcast.
I mean, look at you. You're in Greece right now. Who the fuck records podcasts out of Greece?
That is true. And I have had to beg the newly elect prime minister for internet access just for this day so I can record this episode.
And shit, the internet access right now, it's not doing you any favors. I'm just saying it's quite bad. It's quite bad.
It's quite bad.
Fortunately, we're using Riverside because we're not broke around here. Muscle and Feels, biggest baller podcast you've ever listened to. Trust me. Riverside, cameras, professional-ish microphones, lighting spots. We got it all. First episode, more of a budget than most podcasts in their lifetime.
Exactly. And allow me to note that the episode he was commenting on was probably the N1 experience, the CAS experience podcast, because he made some specific comments, I think, because we did comment on his comments on that study with 5 people, and he specifically told you, would you like to share the actual comments that he made? So one of the criticisms we made was that he had referred to a study with, I think, 5 participants, and that study was presented with very little caution, and it was presented as like, it was the perfect study. And what was his response?
So he said, so he sent like literally 8 messages in a row, none of which I responded to. So he kept double texting. My image of him was that he was lying on his bed with his face down, kicking his legs in the air when he saw that I read the messages, and he was very excited about it every time. But then realized I didn't respond. So he messaged me with the last message being, "Oh, wait, wait, wait. I'm sorry, last one. A study using 5 subjects is underpowered," in quotation marks. Brackets, "tell me you don't understand confidence intervals without telling me." And that was essentially the message. And it's like, my brother, you have no formal education in sports science, and you most likely don't understand confidence intervals at all. It's not really a good comeback from using a study that has 5 subjects where the variance is likely quite high. So,
And that's the segment of the podcast where we talk about Paul Carter, I guess.
hey,
Zip.
we had one episode dedicated to him. Now we're doing a segment for him every time.
Yes,
Different
I
story
mean
every time.
we can go down that route, Paul, but we'll spare you. And
We can do 2 segments every episode. One can be Paul Carter. One can be long musclings research.
we are on. Yeah,
Deal?
I mean that's the podcast essentially now. The PC long muscle length partials
LMLPC, whatever.
LMLPC podcast, and
Um,
we gotta say that this is probably one of the few podcasts on smoke in this field. Usually, there's a lot of disclaimers and a lot of hey, I respect, but no, we are on smoke, and I was on smoke during the seminar as well. Anyways,
straight up beefing everyone in the industry. Industry on notice, you feel me?
I like hey Siri, play No Friends in the Industry.
Now playing No Friends in the Industry by Drake.
Let's go. All right,
Let's do it. Copyright strike. Yeah, so coming back to the range of motion, sorry, not range of motion, reps in reserve meme, not more range of motion. Coming back to the reps in reserve meme I shared, which prompted Paul Correr to become best friends with me before backstabbing me once again. There has been some cool research coming out recently from the good people over at Data Driven Strength and Florida University, looking at the effects of reps in reserve and how close to failure you train on both hypertrophy and strength adaptations. So specifically what they did was they conducted a meta-analysis and meta-regression on that topic. Now, the way this analysis differed from previous analyses is kind of in 2 broad aspects. The first one is that they included a lot more studies than previously, because they didn't just look at studies that specifically were examining the effect of reps in reserve during a set on hypertrophy and strength. They also included studies that indirectly looked at this research question. So studies, for example, that use cluster sets, where one group, for example, would do a set of 5 with their 5 rep max, whereas the other group would do, say, a set of 3 with their 5 rep max, rest for a minute, do another set of 3, another set of 3, etc., where you can approximate that, for example, for the first set, because they were using the 5 rep max for 3 reps, they had 2 reps in reserve. And so if that type of study also measured hypertrophy and strength adaptations, that data can be used to get at a larger data set to answer the question of how close to failure should we train to maximize hypertrophy and strength adaptations. So first of all, it included more data as a result of that sort of methodological decision. And the second broad aspect in which it differed is that previous analyses did something that probably wasn't quite appropriate for the research question. They dichotomized failure and non-failure as just that, right? So either a group trained to failure or they trained not to failure. In reality, that's not a very helpful or informative way of looking at that variable, because we are interested in saying, okay, well, non-failure can mean a lot of things. It can mean 2 reps in a tank, 1 rep in a tank, 10 reps in a tank, 20 reps in a tank. But how close to failure should we train? We don't care about not failure versus failure. We care about how close. So that's what this meta-analysis did, is that it viewed reps in reserve and how close to failure was trained as a continuous variable, plotting the results based on how many reps in reserve you had.
Yeah. And the closest thing we had to not dichotomizing fully before this meta-analysis, aka a series of meta-regressions, was a meta-analysis that looked at either volitional failure or momentary failure and then non-failure. So that was the closest thing we had to somewhat quantifying proximity to failure, but that's not really quantifying it. What was interesting though, and I'd like to hear your take on it, is that the way they approached there's like they didn't do a systematic search, and they just looked at all the evidence that was available. They looked at pre-printed articles as well, theses, and it's not something that you usually see in. I mean, this wasn't a systematic review, so it makes sense. But even in just meta-analysis, you usually see like a very specific search. They did have inclusion criteria though, so I guess that sorts that out.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I actually hadn't even noticed that aspect, so thank you for putting it out. It's interesting. Equally, I think that while some people might see it as a limitation, I think that with forward and backward citation searching, for example, like looking at what papers did this one paper on Reps and Reserve cite, and then what papers have cited this paper since then. Doing that, you can find, in my experience, pretty much all the data that you would with systematic searching, and sometimes even more than that, because you can miss out on certain things based on keywords and you not being fully present during screening, for example, being a bit inattentive.
And they also there were also a group that followed very, very open science practices. So everything that they did, including some of the stuff that we'll talk about in a second, like predicting reps in reserve, everything that they did is fully available there. So they were very transparent with the processes that they followed, which is great to see, and kind of tackles the potential criticism that such an approach would have. So if they took the classic peer review academia route where they just listed, hey, we did this, and if you want more information, reach out. I think there you could be like, we don't really know what you did, but but in this case, I think that's different.
For sure. And if anything, I think the amount of detail and subgroup analyses was almost too much.
Yes.
If you go into their supplementary materials on OSF, there's some links across the paper to go there. It is a maze over there. Like, you're going to be looking around for the thing you're looking for a while. But equally, they really paid due diligence to detailing how the methods were carried out and so forth. Which actually brings me to, before we jump to the results, one of the biggest criticisms of the study, which is that the methods used, for example, as I mentioned, for cluster set studies or that sort of thing, they estimated reps in reserve based on the design. And so the estimate of reps in reserve for each group may be slightly off, right? Like on average, maybe you make an assumption that then says that in reality, let's say they were training with 2 reps in reserve, you estimate it to be 3 for some studies. That then leads to some additional variance. And so the ultimate effect size estimate you get for how much better, for example, training to failure is versus not training to failure, or what have you, maybe slightly less accurate, essentially. But that is a trade-off probably worth making, in my view, depending on the exact amount of variance that introduced, because you are in exchange getting a way bigger data set, which, to me at least, provided the assumptions used in estimating reps in reserve are pretty okay. I think it's a trade-off worth making, ultimately.
Yeah. And at the same time, the justification, the authors did justify every prediction that they made, and they presented their thinking behind the predictions made. And at the end of the day, this is the best that we could, the best, or one of the best ways that we can look at the current literature as it stands. So until we have more studies on the topic that have directly explored the relationship between repetitions in reserve and hypertrophy and strength, I think this look at the literature may be the most complete look to this day. I also wanted to comment on the maze image that you drew. I'm not sure how much input a certain British man had on the data analysis, but I would expect that man, aka James Steele, to be there in front of the maze, ready to guide you, but getting lost in the maze with you and being like, "Hey, it's fine, we'll sleep here."
Yeah, 100%. I think there was a slight resemblance, an uncanny resemblance between a certain James Steele and a certain Zach Robinson, but we won't go there. I actually had the privilege of staying with the authors of this paper in Denver when I was in the USA recently, presenting at the ACSM. So I got to speak about the paper as well. And so hopefully my takes on the paper aren't too shitty. But let's jump into the results, right? Do you want to take the hypertrophy results?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the summarized version is that the closer you trained to failure, the better hypertrophy outcomes you got.
Pretty much. And importantly, it was almost a non-linear relationship
Yeah.
where as you got closer and closer to failure, the improvement in hypertrophy with each rep you push closer to failure actually seemed to grow, the marginal improvement. And actually, when the authors differentiated between volitional and momentary failure, so you can kind of conceptualize volitional failure, and actually I made a video on this. So if you're on YouTube right now and you want to watch a video on it, search Wolf Coaching, plug myself in. But essentially, they differentiated between volitional failure and momentary failure, where volitional failure refers to ending a set when you think you can't do another rep, and momentary failure refers to ending a set when you actually try a rep and fail it, right? So momentary failure is a greater degree of intensity, so to speak, whereas momentary failure is a slightly lesser degree, but both could roughly be conceptualized as 0 reps in the tank, right?
Mhm.
And when they differentiated between those two things, they saw that when you went from volitional failure, which is kind of easier, all the way to momentary failure, you saw even further improvements in how much hypertrophy they saw. So it really seems like there's a consistent and pretty strong relationship. And even if you look at the variance in the estimate, in pretty much in all likelihood, you do see a benefit of training closer to failure for hypertrophy in general. Even if
Yeah.
you kind of see it with the worst case scenario, even if you low with the lowest estimate, it's still a pretty meaningful benefit.
Yeah.
Um, Contextualize it a little bit. The effect sizes seen are roughly on par or actually superior to the sort of effect sizes you'd expect going from, say, 10 sets per week per muscle group to maybe 20 sets per week per muscle group. So pretty
Yeah.
substantial effects, kind of on par with volume additions that people have been shouting about from the rooftops for years now.
Yeah. And at the same time, what was very interesting is was that going from, let's say, 3 to 4 reps in reserve to 0 to 2 reps in reserve, that seemed like it made a substantial difference, which kind of went against what, as you said in one of your videos as well, your beliefs and to a certain extent my beliefs as well, where we thought, hey, yeah, training close to failure is important as long as you're somewhere there, like a true RP 6 or 7 set. I wouldn't bet a lot more money on an RP 9 or 8 set for hypertrophy outcomes. But now that obviously has changed.
Yeah, it's definitely changed a lot. And it's interesting. It's the opposite of what we thought, as you mentioned. And it's certainly changed my approach to training for hypertrophy. Specifically nowadays, beforehand, I would probably average about 2 to 3 reps in reserve, whereas now I'm closer to maybe 0 to 1 rep in reserve. So it's a shift of like 2 reps in reserve. So broadly speaking, how I structure my training nowadays, and for clients and athletes as well, is that I typically have clients and athletes train for hypertrophy be between 10 and 20 sets per week per muscle group, probably closer to 10 to 15. And that's counting an exercise is only counting towards one muscle group. If you count it as like bench counting towards tricep, chest, and front delts, I would say closer to 15 to 20. And I think if you're in that range for volume, you're likely pretty much and getting some decent rest times as well, which a lot of the case with these volume studies isn't the case. I think if you're doing that and getting 15 to 20 sets per muscle group per week when counted indirectly as well, I think you're kind of on the top end of how much benefit you could see from adding volume. And so at that point, I would probably push most sets between 2 reps in reserve and failure. So what I would typically do is start an exercise, the first set, with about 2 reps in the tank, and then gradually work my way closer to failure for the last set. And the last set, fail the set, whether that's volitional failure for exercises where I don't think it's safe to fail. Like, for example, a barbell bench press without a spotter, or a squat without a spotter, without spotter arms. For those exercises, I might take it to just volitional failure, where I don't think I can get the next one, and that's where I end the set. Or for a lot of isolation exercises, or for exercises where it's safe to fail, like the barbell row, the pull down, the pull up, etc., I will actually take it all the way to the house and go to momentary failure. And that's generally how I approach training to failure versus not for hypertrophy nowadays. And then from there, if that volume is in place roughly and you're training pretty close to failure, I think that you can either, if you're still recovering just fine with that program essentially, and you want to increase something, I think generally I would probably increase volume slightly. And that's just because I think that if there is something to volume load, so essentially how much weight are you lifting for how many reps, for how many sets across a session for hypertrophy, if you train to failure on the first set for an exercise and generally train to failure earlier in the session, you may find that the rest of your session takes a big hit. So if there's something to volume load and maximizing that across the session, I think that training to failure too much across the session may be slightly worse. I mean, that's very speculative. I don't think
Yep.
there's a huge issue with someone just training to failure all the time for hypertrophy. But I think that if you're already training pretty hard, pretty close to failure, and you can either add a bit more volume or train a bit closer to failure still, I would generally tend towards a bit more volume depending on the case.
Yeah, yeah, and it's important to clarify that, because training to failure has had that good and bad reps. So there's the one group on one end, the bros that would, we're always in support of training extremely hard and pushing each set to failure and making sure you're getting the most out of each set. And so as Mike Mentzer used to do, obviously joking, but also you have the other group, and some of the science-based caricatures would fall in that group, where training to failure is extremely fatiguing and you're not getting anything more out of it. But in many cases, especially in scenarios like Milo just described, training to failure can just is an easy way for you to guarantee that you are actually training to failure, or at least very close to failure.
For sure. And I think that the good news is that most people, if they're actually trying pretty hard, will be reasonably accurate in my experience. Like if you're actually trying to train to failure, like fail rep, generally you won't be too far off, especially if you're training relatively heavy. With higher reps, it can be a bit more difficult, and we have actually a paper on this. But if you're training relatively heavy and actually gunning for failure, you'll typically end up pretty close.
Yeah.
I will say the evidence-based crowd for a few years now has very much noceboed everyone with regards to failure. Where it's seen as this thing that's super hard to reach, and if you train to failure on leg press, you're gonna vomit. I think vomiting is a big thing nowadays in the fitness industry for some reason. And then equally, they've also noceboed how much fatigue it causes, I think. So, fun fact, as part of one of my studies, where I took part in it myself, the upper body study we described previously, I think on the longer muscle length episodes, all of them. During during that study, I trained to failure, volitional to momentary failure for every set, pretty much, for upper body, and that was 3 sessions a week, 3 to 4 sets per exercise, all of them to momentary or volitional failure. And sure, it's fatiguing, but I actually tended to recover pretty well between sessions, and that was kind of gauged by when at the end of the program I took a few days rest and tested my strength. My strength was actually about the same as it was during the program when I was fatigued from the other sessions. So it didn't seem to cause that much fatigue to go to failure in the first place. And especially once you get used to it, I think it's relatively small. And I also don't think it's that hard to go to failure, especially for heavier sets. Like if you're training between 5 and 15 reps typically, the weight's heavy enough that you kind of reach failure naturally if you just do more reps. It's not like you need to psych yourself up. And it's kind of a different type of failure as well if you psych yourself up versus you don't, in my experience.
Yeah,
if you psych yourself up, going to failure might be a bit more difficult. But if you're not going to a set particularly hyped up, reaching failure isn't that difficult. And it's not that psychologically draining either, I find.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the hyping up, because I think people have associated training to failure with a session where you're on 600 milligrams of caffeine with your friends there, and you're pushing sets actually past failure, or they're also coming in and you're doing an extra few forced reps, and you are trying to beat a specific rep target. But my training personally has been to failure for the majority of it, maybe some exercises excluded or some sets excluded, for the past few years. And I don't know, unless you are doing 30 sets per week and you're taking multiple sets of squats to failure, even then there's a chance you'd be fine. But I don't know. I think there's a bit of fear mongering going on, and there's the word fatigue as well has been thrown quite a bit when it comes to higher rep sets, or even training to failure with higher rep sets. Which sure, maybe it may be more fatiguing to do a certain number of reps versus another, but at the end of the day, just because it's more fatiguing, that fatigue may not necessarily mask your ability to see progress or to make gains or have you bedridden for 3 weeks.
For sure. And I think that with high reps and high reps being more fatiguing specifically, I can see the rationale for it on 2 accounts. Number one, when you're going to failure with relatively lighter loads, you only fail the set when you're unable to produce the force required to lift that light load, right? So you need to induce a greater degree of fatigue from start of set to end of set to fail the set. compared to, say, lifting 80% of your max. If you're lifting 80% of your max for as many reps as you can, you only need to drop from 100% of your max to 80%. It's 20% drop off in your ability to produce force, let's say. Whereas if you're lifting 40% of your max, that's a 60% drop. So as a very rough, like intuitive example of why it might be more fatiguing, I do see why it makes sense. And equally, we have data suggesting that A, it's harder to train to failure with high reps, like in terms of people typically don't manage to as much. They underestimate how many more reps they could have done more. And B, also, we have data suggesting that higher reps tend to be more uncomfortable for people. Like they report higher degrees of discomfort during higher rep sets than during lower rep sets. So in general, it kind of seems like it would make sense to be that it would be more fatiguing, but equally, we don't have any strong, compelling data on fatigue directly suggesting that actually, yeah, higher reps are definitely more fatiguing. So until we have that data, I'm not worried about it, and in all likelihood, neither should you.
Or take the blue and red pill together, take both pills together, and don't train to failure. And don't listen to the science and the estimated reps. Thank you, Zach Robinson, for just guessing what RIR each set was, and then saying, "Yeah, just look in the repository files. Our methods are there," knowing that nobody's going to be looking.
No one's
what you
gonna
actually,
look.
Nobody's looking. That's true. Joking aside, but yeah,
Take the black pill, stop training entirely because training doesn't do anything.
does training make you money? No, don't do it.
True. All right, back on the watches segment of the show.
All right, what's on your wrist today, Milo Wolf?
I got the Casio G-Shock DW6900. It's a classic. It's good for training because you can't break that shit. If I was wearing my Grand Seiko or whatever during training, I'd be worried about messing up the mechanical movement. But in this case, with the G-Shock, I can walk the streets of the Bronx, where Lehman College is situated, without feeling worried at all, and it's phenomenal.
Nice, that's great.
Stealth wealth, am I right?
Stealth wealth, indeed. But walking the streets on a golden skateboard that is being carried by 5 people, by a Rolex AD, the Rolex AD himself, wearing a Patek Philippe. So that said, training to fail. I want to ask your opinion because I saw some comments on your video. So, as with everything, people have this knee-jerk reaction when it comes to science because they don't understand science and they don't understand the fact that, hey, science is not supposed to be an absolute answer, and it evolves and it changes, and it's not as easy as it seems to figure out everything. So people will hit you with have hit you with Mike Mentzer or the bodybuilders have been saying that for years. I guess they were right, or we knew this already. What is your take on that?
Well, with all due respect to Mike Mentzer and similar figures,
R.I.P.
Mike Mentzer didn't know shit.
R.I.P.
Like R.I.P. I think he's dead.
I'm trying to be somewhat respectful here, but
indeed, I said it with all due respect. What do you mean? Everyone who says with all due respect ever has been very respectful and definitely meant that.
Yes, sir. Can I you're gone.
With all due respect to Mike Mentzer, he didn't know shit. I think that a lot of people have said a lot of shit about training in the past and have eventually been proven right. But just because you said something doesn't mean you knew it. You just made a guess and it turned out to be correct, or somewhat correct, or likely correct. I can say right now that I don't think that barbell squats are as good as hack squats, but unless my rationale for saying so is particularly compelling, and there's a very solid rationale for it, I don't know it. I'm just making a guess. And so I think a lot of people love the idea of some old wise figure in bodybuilding or powerlifting knowing all this stuff 40 years ago and that the science is always behind the practice and shit like that. It's like, no, the practice is super diverse. There's fucking people out there who think that squats are the best. There's people out there who think that leg press are the best. People out there who think that squats hurt you. People think that squats will cure your knee pain. Like, pretty much for every school of thought, there are practitioners out there preaching it. And so if eventually anything ever is somewhat confirmed by science, there will be some cocksucker out there saying, did you know it's someone already said that? And you're like, bro.
Why is Mike Mentzer on the call? How am I hearing him?
That's crazy. And so it's just the most unnecessary and weird comment. It's the same comment as, guess the bros were right. It's like, my brother, what bros? There's like 1 million bros out there. They say all types of shit. What do you mean?
Plus, the fact that the fact that the guess of, hey, training very hard is good. I mean, it's not really a revolutionary or extremely risky take to have, right? Same as with certain diseases where people were like, yeah, this is not going to be the end of humanity. And then they were like, yeah, I was right. Yeah, okay, your take wasn't like, you made a relatively easy bet, and the bet was training very hard is good for muscle growth. Science a year ago said, yeah, you still need to train pretty hard. Maybe you don't need to train all out. And like, that was it.
For sure. And the worst thing is when these people are blatantly disregarding the evidence on a topic. So there'll be certain things like, I don't know, volume now, right? Where there's still some people who hold these figures on very high pedestals who will be like, no, Arthur Jones used to train with one set a week. Therefore, and he was right. So I'm going to train with the same thing. And then if ever there is a study suggesting that one set a week is slightly better, like one study out of many, he will have the day of his life, right? But I think these people often also disregard the evidence upon which such opinions are supposed to be based on, and instead just literally follow people as gurus. And
Yeah.
it's sad, you know.
Yeah, it's sad, and as you said, man, like, it doesn't really add anything to the conversation. Plus, the fact that they sorry, somebody's calling me while I'm speaking. The fact that they had made a bet and they were proven right doesn't mean that we shouldn't be conducting science to make sure that their hypothesis was right. They had made a hypothesis that still needs to be confirmed. We can't just take somebody's word, as you said, 1,000 bros, yeah, or different schools of thought. One was right, sure. We still need science in order to lay that base and confirm that they were right. Otherwise, we wouldn't really know. So, because there've been other people as well, and bodybuilders like Phil Heath. Who else? Lee Priest, that were of a different school of thought, where they were like, you don't need to annihilate it was like stimulate, don't annihilate. Remember that
Yep.
phrase where they were like, you shouldn't be training ultra hard because then you're damaging the muscle too much and you're not growing. So I'm doing a face now for those listening, where the face is like science still needs to confirm who's
Disgruntled.
right and who's wrong.
Yeah, disgruntled face. I agree, and I just think there's a certain archetype, and I'm not gonna lie, the Mike Mentzer fanboys are the worst. Like, there's just a certain archetype of Mike Mentzer fanboy without a profile picture who will comment under your shit saying, Mike Mentzer trained like this, he knew it all along. And you're just like, my brother, why are you idolizing this one person instead of
Yeah,
having
but it's okay. Like, yeah, he was a guy that was training very hard and awesome bodybuilder, and added like, I'm pretty sure he had some nice things to say, but I don't know.
cool mustache, bro?
I don't see the relevance to the relevance to new scientific evidence coming out, and saying, hey, this guy was right. Okay, yeah,
You know
sure.
what the most fire comment in that thread was? It was Mike Mentzer was super smart, bro. He was a pre-med student. And it's like, I don't doubt that he's smart, but I'm not sure that I would listen to the average pre-med student when it comes to my training advice in science, you know?
You know who else is a actual medical doctor? Dr. George Touliatos, who also advises muscular development. Just because somebody is an MD, you could be an MD and have no idea about training or nutrition. Literally, you may know the human body well, depending on what you're. Because it's like, just because you're a medical doctor, that's an umbrella term. You could literally be I don't know, a foot doctor or whatever. Not that, but you know what I mean. You could be a
Yeah.
biopathologist. You could be a pathologist like he is. You could be somebody who's an expert at reading blood work. You probably know the human body, but that doesn't mean you've kept up with the latest scientific evidence on resistance training and muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, they're very different things. Cool. Let's close that
What is this
tangent.
beef? The beef episode today,
Indeed.
and
Fuck.
unnecessarily aggressive towards Mike Mentzer.
No, not aggressive towards Mike Mentzer. Aggressive towards Mike Mentzer fanboys. Mike Mentzer is fine. Cool mustache, as I said. I like him.
Cool guy.
let's move on from hypertrophy to strength. Do you want to break down the strength findings from meta-analysis?
Yes. So the strength findings were the opposite from hypertrophy. So there wasn't a clear. So that the closer you went to failure, that didn't necessarily translate to more strength gains. However, there were what I really liked about the discussion and part of the paper is that the authors did make some points pro training close to failure for strength. Um, but overall, what was found is that closer proximities to failure did not lead to greater strength increases, maximal strength increases. And if anything, they may be somewhat somewhat deleterious to strength development.
Yep, pretty much. And as you mentioned, not really a relationship between how close to failure you trained and strength adaptations, with one potential caveat that the authors pointed out. There is a compelling body of evidence building around, and it's actually not even building; it's pretty established at this point, that training heavy, if you want to maximize if you want to improve your maximal strength, like your ability to lift a weight for 1 rep, for example, is going to lead to better strength improvements than lifting lighter, right?
Hmm.
So lifting 90% of your max is going to lead to greater strength improvements for your 1 rep max than lifting 50% of your max, which is kind of intuitive, right? It's generally falling under the umbrella term of specificity. So strength improvements are load specific. So while you could say, well, if there's no relationship between RP and strength, why do I even need to train heavy? Well, they might be distinct things. So what the authors kind of hypothesized or speculated in the paper is that if an increase in how close to failure you train is caused by just doing more reps at the same weight, like let's
Yeah.
say, for example, you're lifting 75% of your max for 10 reps instead of 5, that's not going to make you stronger than doing just 5 reps with that weight. However, conversely, if you going closer to failure results in you lifting more weight on the bar and closer to your max,
Hmm.
that likely does result in greater strength adaptations.
Yeah.
So, in all likelihood, doing a set of 1 at RP 8 is causing more strength adaptations than a set of 5 at RP 8.
Yeah.
Likewise, though, doing a set of 3 at RP 5, for example, is going to cause the same strength improvements as a set of 5 at RP 7, right? So just doing more reps with the same weight and going closer to failure as a result. But it's going to cause less strength improvements than doing, say, a set of 3 at RP 7. So going heavier to go closer to failure.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And yeah, and the way the authors discussed it was in regards to force production and the fact that as you're getting deeper into a higher repetition set and you're getting fatigued, you're unable to produce as much force as you would or express it in a way as you are at the beginning of the set, or when you're doing low repetitions at a heavy weight, which automatically lead to a close proximity to failure. So
For sure.
yeah, at the same time, they also made an argument in regards to potentially some close to failure work with heavier loads and grinding out some reps may have something to offer as far as skills, building the skill to grind a rep out, and so on and so forth. Although some speculation involved there, right? Right. Is that me? Yo, you're on mute.
Yeah, yo, that's your Wi-Fi.
I'm not sure. I can see you
No, it is
fine.
your Wi-Fi. I can guarantee it's your Wi-Fi. I'm permanently at 99% uploaded. So,
Same.
are you?
Yeah, since the beginning.
Wait. We can cut this bit out, whatever.
Yeah, so
Yes.
what I mentioned was some heavy sets where you grind out a rep at the end and you do that triple instead of single and you are like at RP 9 to 9.5. Obviously we have studies showing that powerlifters can make really good gains with heavy load training at those RPs, but at the same time it may be that higher RPE or closer to failure training for strength may be useful in certain contexts at certain volumes for building the skill to be able to grind a rep out.
For sure. And I think that summarizes the mechanisms involved between training close to failure and strength adaptations. One quick addition is that The reason why there might not be a relationship between RPE and strength adaptations, in my view, might be because if you're being explosive and concentric, like trying to lift the weight as explosively as possible, the
Hmm.
force production can actually be relatively high even when you're not training close to failure, right? Like, and if anything, going closer to failure will generally result in less force production as the set goes on, so it's less specific to 1 rep max, where you're
Hmm.
exerting maximum force by definition. For hypertrophy, on the other hand, the case was made in the paper that the reason for this was predominantly as a result of a complete recruitment and activation of all muscle fibers, as opposed to if you're leaving 5 reps in the tank, for example, it could be the case that certain higher threshold motor units, like the faster twitch units that are bigger and likely grow more as a result of training, and or certain fibers might not be getting as much stimulus.
Hmm.
And so by going to failure, you're ensuring that all muscle fibers get recruited, activated, produce tension, and because they're producing tension and experience tension passively as well, thus results in greater hypertrophy across the whole muscle. That's kind of the mechanism that they posited.
Yeah.
Nice. I think that wraps up this topic pretty well. Anything else to
So
add?
yeah, I mean, I guess we could give some practical takeaways, which we have mostly done for hypertrophy. For strength, I would say that, hey, again, prioritize heavy loads. Um, those are what you primarily need to focus on when you're trying to get stronger. At the same time, you could add lower RPE work in, or lower load training in for strength, but make sure that you are keeping that at a lower RPE and further away from failure, and lifting with maximal intent, which you could combine with some hypertrophy training. Um, that said, I don't see why you couldn't do a single at RP 8 or 7 or 9 on top of your hypertrophy training. But if you're a strength athlete doing a set of 6 or 10 reps to failure or very close to failure, we'll probably have quite a bit to offer as far as hypertrophy goes. But as far as maximal strength, you're probably leaving gains or adding unnecessary fatigue, because you could just stop that set 3, 4, 5 reps away from failure.
Yeah, pretty much. I agree with that. I would add that if you're going to be doing some maximal training for powerlifting, I would generally still keep rep ranges below 5 for the most part for main lifts, right? Because if you're keeping RP submaximal, by definition, it's not going to be very good for hypertrophy, from what we know.
Mm-hmm.
So you may as well make the rep range relatively low to have the added benefit of being relatively heavy for strength, which, as we discussed, is quite important.
Yep.
But yeah, otherwise, I pretty much agree wholeheartedly with recommendations for strength.
I appreciate you, my brother. And on that note, the beef episode is over. Thank you for listening. Apologies to both Paul Carter and Mike Mentzer. I'm taking the apology back to keep this the beef episode, and I'm giving it again because I felt bad. We'll see you on the next episode, which will definitely be shown on a different day, not directly after this. Peace.